Hello, and welcome to Improbable Things. I'm J. Grace Pennington, and this is my podcast where I share 6 improbable thoughts before breakfast. And those thoughts are 6 things regarding reading, writing, or science fiction. So I've got my 6 things ready, and I'm ready to get started. Number 1, I wanted to continue updating all of you on how the writing is going on the first draft of Firmament Humanoid, the 8th book, I believe, in the Firmament series, and I've been working on it pretty much every day. I did end up taking the weekend off this past weekend, and then I kind of regretted it because then my needed word count for each day went up above 1,000 instead of under 1,000, where I much prefer to keep it. So I'm going to try not to do that again, and to write more consistently every day, because I've given myself about another month left to write it. I think I put my deadline at April 15th. And so I did break 15,000 words day before yesterday, I believe. And it's been going okay, but I'm definitely hitting a slump these past few days. Like the first while I was more excited about it. And this is very normal. This is how pretty much every project goes for me anyway, where I was real excited for the first bit, and just I'm slowly kind of like starting to hit that point where I'm kind of bored with it. I don't want to do it. And so yeah, but then I do find, and here it helps that I've written so many novels, that I do have plenty of memories of this having happened before, and of being able to get back out of the slump again. Like it kind of just, goes up and down, how I'm feeling on the day, what part I am in the story, etc. And so I'm kind of hitting a transition point in the story where they're really, fully embracing the mission and the plot of this book. So I'm hoping once I kind of get past that and they're really, they're just really actually getting into what they're doing in this story, hopefully that'll help bring me out of it. But it's really a challenge to write in these times when you just don't want to do it. And it is, so mentally draining. I find the first drafts especially, like you're literally pulling these story points and just making it up out of thin air, out of nothing. And I find it very draining. And so even more so if I'm not really feeling it. But I have found the past year or so that it does help me so much to have to set a daily goal and to be able to see my progress visually. And so I have, something where I'm tracking it and tracking my daily word count and how that aligns with my goal, etc. And it helps me a lot to keep me going in these times where, honestly, if I didn't have that, I'd probably be going, I'm just gonna take a break for a few days, and then I probably would take years again before finishing it, like I did with Firmament Eleftheria. So I think having this word count and the fact that it's not very high, like I did get it back under 1,000, is going to help me be really consistent. It has in the last couple of books that I wrote. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, broke 15,000 words, which is pretty good progress for something I'm expecting to be about 45 to 50,000. And number 2, I did start reading Eleftheria to my husband, and it's been good. He does, as I expected, have lots of good, insightful things to say about it. He's good at pinpointing problems with story, and just has a great sense for what works and what doesn't. And he hasn't disappointed in his feedback on this, but I do find I just always have this struggle when getting feedback from a reader with just what exactly do I take, because there are so many things that are personal preference, but then there's also things that really aren't and that are just work or don't work. And so that's why I always find I really need at least 3 readers, if not more, because I need to get a sense of which of the things that this person is saying are just objective and really need to be changed, and which things is just their preference and would not be the same for someone else. And so I was telling my husband that as he was pointing out some things that bothered him in the story and in the writing so far, is that, okay, so if I have 2 other people read it and nobody else mentions that, I'm going to say, okay, that's probably just him. And it's probably, I'm not thinking I need to necessarily take that advice. But if there comes a point where everyone is pointing this out, even if I don't see the problem with it, that's where I'm just going to trust and be like, okay, this is actually a concern. Because, it's not just the one reader that's saying this. And I remember having that experience. I remember particularly one point in my book, October, where I had read it. I was reading it a little bit at a time to my writers group. And the leader of the group, afterwards, I was talking to him one time after I'd read a specific portion of the book, and he had kind of said like, oh, this part didn't really make sense to me. I didn't understand this lady's reaction. Like, it seemed so over the top, etc. And I was like, okay, whatever, different people have different opinions. Just, I didn't really necessarily take it that seriously, but I did file it away in my head. And then later on, my editor gets back with me about that exact same part, saying, I didn't really understand this reaction. It seemed kind of over the top, like almost word for word. So at that point, it's like, okay, two people who I have a lot of respect for, their story sensibilities, are both saying this. So obviously I need to tone it down. So those things, that's why I just find it's the whole, like a multitude of counselors. Like, it just gives a lot better perspective than if I just had one person giving me feedback. It would be so much harder to tell which things really need to be changed and which things don't. So anyway, I am looking forward. I did send it out to one other reader, and I'm gonna work on getting at least one or two others so that I can get that perspective. And also, number 3, one thing that my husband has mentioned, and that he is definitely not the only one to mention this in my writing in general, is I just really struggle with descriptions. And I know exactly why it is. It's because I may have talked about this before, I don't remember, but I have aphantasia, which means that I cannot visualize things in my mind. So if I'm like, thinking of a person or a place, like, I know other people have told me they can sort of like see it in their head, like almost as if you're seeing it in front of you, I guess. Or people will tell me, like, when they're reading, it's like they're watching a movie in their head or whatever. But I just can't. I can't call images to my mind at all. And so I always just thought that's how everyone was until fairly recently, like the last few years. I was like, oh my goodness, this is not necessarily the majority of people, but there is a term for it. So anyway, super interesting, but it does, so when I read books, I do tend to kind of gloss over the descriptions because it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Like, it does, like, I will file away the facts. Like, so for instance, you're telling me that this person has blonde hair and blue eyes and that they were like, such and so height or whatever. I'll remember those things about them, but I just can't see it in my head. And so if there's a lot of description, I tend to just kind of not really register it. And so that's just how I'm used to reading, because that's the way that it works for my brain. I can't, I was trying to explain to my husband, I'm like, even if I read it, even if I, like, I just can't see it, even if I'm trying to, like, I can't. And so that it does definitely come across in my writing. I'm very, very minimalist with description, much too much. And I mean, it's fine to have different amounts of description. Like, some people use more, some people use less, both are fine, but there's definitely a point where it's too much. And there's definitely a point where it's too little. Like, as I was reading to my husband, he was telling me, like, I just have no real sense of where anybody is. Like, I don't have a sense of the atmosphere of any of these places. Like, when they go from one area to another, I don't really have a feel for where they're going. Like, it just feels like they're just sort of all like out in the middle of nowhere. So like, he just can't get a grasp on that. And so that's where I really, really rely on reader feedback. And I've had so many people tell me this with my writing in general, that they have trouble figuring it out, that kind of thing. And so I've just learned to rely more and more on other people for that, and to tell me, like, okay, because sometimes I've had where I'll try to do the description and it ends up to be too much. Like, people are like, okay, you don't really have to describe every book on the shelf or whatever. So it takes a little extra work for me, definitely, this aspect of writing and of storytelling. But that's where I'm really grateful for other people's strengths. And so yeah, I'm going to definitely have to work on that. So number 4, I mentioned last week that I was reading the 3rd book in the Divergent series. The 3rd book is called Allegiant, and this is the first time I'd read it. And I mentioned that so far, I think I was about halfway through, it was not good. So I finished it a few days ago and it was still not good. And it was very disappointing because I loved the first two books. And honestly, I'm sorry, but the third one was so bad. Like it was so bad. I could not get into it at all for many, many different reasons. It was way, oh, it was just way too much. And there was so many plot holes that I just couldn't get past. There was too many new characters that didn't really grab me, and it was like they changed everything, like literally everything that had gone on the other two books was different, like everything was just and I didn't, the ending just didn't even really grab me, even though it was supposed to be, you know, very emotional and impacting. Like it just wasn't good, and that was so disappointing because really honestly, like some of my favorite young adult books, the first couple, and I loved the concept, and then she basically like ditched the entire concept and most of what had gone on in the first two books for the third book, and I was just like, I don't understand what happened. So that was definitely disappointing, but you know, it is what it is. So sad. And then number 5, am I currently reading? So after that, I've started reading The Beekeeper's Apprentice by Laurie R. King, and I have read it before. I've read it many, many times actually, but it's been many years since I last read it, and there's a whole series after it. So I read the first book many times, and then several years ago I read the second book, and then maybe like 5 or 6 years ago I finally read the third book, and that's all. And there's like, I don't know, like 10 or 12 books. There's a lot of them. And and the last one was released last year, so I don't think she's finished. And I was like, you know what? Like I love the first book, and the other two were pretty good from what I remember, which I don't remember that much. But I'm like, why have I not finished this series? Like I just need to be like, I'm going to read this series this year. But it's been so long since I read the first one, and I do love it so much. And someone had mentioned it on Instagram, which is what kind of brought it, you know, really to my memory and my attention. So my copy of it is back at my parents' house. So I got a copy of The Beekeeper's Apprentice from the library, and going to be really buckling down and reading the rest of the series. So if you're not familiar, The Beekeeper's Apprentice is it's almost like fan fiction. I don't know what the threshold for fan fiction is. Like if it's a like legitimate published novel, is it still fan fiction? But anyway, it's about Sherlock Holmes, and about a young girl that becomes his apprentice, and because she just has like the same kind of mind that he does, like the same intelligence and deductive reasoning and just natural proclivity for this way of thinking and of figuring things out, and so they just like relate on that level that most people can't, and she ends up getting to work with him. So I love the book, and I've heard good things about a lot of the others in the series, so definitely ready to just knock all those off my list. And number 6, I wanted to kind of continue on some thoughts that I've been having as I'm reading The Beekeeper's Apprentice, because as you might have thought as I was describing it, it seems highly unlikely. Because this is so at the beginning of the first book, she's 15 years old, and he is a lot older. Like he's retired, you know, he's quite middle-aged. And this is, you know, World War I era England. Like it's all very unlikely that, and she does a good job, like, you know, saying this is very unusual, and here's why, here's all the things that conspire together to make this possible when in other times and places and situations it wouldn't have been, or whatever. And I do think she does a good job with that, but still you can't really escape that. It just seems unlikely. But it does definitely require suspension of disbelief, and that's what I wanted to talk about is, you know, I mean, all stories to a certain extent, all fiction requires some suspension of disbelief because it didn't really happen, and you know that, and yet you have to buy into it as you're reading or as you're watching. But then, you know, the more unlikely it is, the harder it is to suspend that. And so I was thinking about that, and I'm like, I'm pretty critical of stories, and I'm pretty skeptical in general, and yet I have no problem buying into this premise and loving the book, and And it's like I'm making a conscious choice where I go like, okay, this wouldn't really happen, but I'm just going to believe that it would. And that's because I love the story and I love the relationship and the characters and I want it to be possible. And I think that's where the key is to suspension of disbelief, is that if you want to believe something, then it becomes much easier. Like, I do think there's a certain extent where there's been things that I've watched or read where I really wanted to buy into it and I just couldn't. It was just too far out there. So I think your brain will stop you at some point. But there is this area where you know this would not happen, but you want to believe in it and you want to engage with the story and be immersed in it. And so you're willing to decide that you're just going to believe in it for the sake of this narrative. And I find that with a lot of science fiction, of course. All speculative fiction requires a lot of suspension of disbelief. And, you know, it's like we all know that warp travel is not a real thing. And we all know that it's extremely unlikely that it would be possible physically. And yet we're willing to buy into it because we need it for this story. We want to believe that a starship could travel between different planets